Just a nurse. That is what everyone assumed when Natalie Hayes walked through the glass doors of Sacred Heart Hospital at 5:05 on a Tuesday morning in March. Just a nurse with steady hands and a faded canvas jacket she peeled off before clocking in, hanging it on the third hook from the left in the break room locker where no one ever looked twice. Just a nurse who had been working the cardiac unit for 93 days, give or take a few hours. They didn't know. Nobody knew. And Natalie intended to keep it that way for as long as the small, quiet life she had chosen would let her. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the nurse's station at Sacred Heart, a symphony of illumination that had played the same note for 23 years without varying a single hertz. The antiseptic smell hung in the air like a benediction, bleach and industrial soap and something else underneath that smelled like surrender. Natalie moved through the cardiac unit in the pre-dawn darkness before the hospital truly woke, when the only sounds were the ventilators breathing for patients who couldn't breathe for themselves, the monitors beeping in their irregular rhythms, the soft squeak of her shoes on linoleum that had been scrubbed so many times it shone like a warning. The tile floors were still wet from the night shift's cleaning. Her boots left no mark. She carried her small leather notebook in her right pocket, the kind soldiers used for field notes, the kind that fit in a palm. Her entries were made in precise capitals with mechanical pencil, the kind that wouldn't bleed if it got wet. 3 milliliter syringes in the supply cabinet. 27. Not 28. She had counted yesterday. The inventory didn't match the order form that came through that afternoon, and it bothered her in the way that small inconsistencies bothered people trained to notice them. Inconsistencies were how people got killed. In Helmand Province, an ammunition count that didn't match the manifest meant someone was selling bullets to the wrong people. In Portland, an inventory discrepancy probably just meant someone had forgotten to log a withdrawal. Probably. The cardiac unit of Sacred Heart stretched across the east wing of the third floor, 12 beds arranged in a careful semicircle, each one equipped with a heart monitor that beeped like Morse code spelling out the difference between alive and not. The nurse's station was the nerve center, a curved desk that faced the beds and the hallway in equal measure, positioned so no one could approach without being seen. Natalie liked that about it. She had always preferred positions with only one approach vector. Old habits. Dead habits now, she told herself every morning, but the habits didn't listen. She had been a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy. She had extracted 12 wounded Marines from a kill zone in Helmand Province with nothing but a tourniquet kit and a voice that didn't shake even when the helicopters were doing strafing runs and the smell of copper and sand filled her lungs with every breath. She had 3 Bronze Stars folded in a wooden box under her bed in a one-bedroom apartment in northwest Portland. A Purple Heart. A Navy Cross that she had never looked at twice. She had stopped looking at those things the day her husband Marcus came home in a flag, and she understood, finally, that heroism was a currency that didn't purchase anything that mattered. So Natalie Hayes had walked away. She had changed her name legally, changed her hair color, changed her life the way other people changed their socks. She had moved to Portland because it rained there and the rain was good for hiding things. She had taken a job at Sacred Heart not because it was remarkable but because it was invisible, a staff of 400 nurses, a man's name not in any of them, her face in the system but not in anyone's memory. She had learned the job in 3 months. Learned who the good doctors were, who the bad ones were. Learned the supply chains and the inventory protocols and the medical procedures that kept people alive and the tiny mistakes that could kill them. She was very good at learning the things that kept people alive. The helicopter landed on the roof at 0612. Its rotors made a sound like the world breaking, a rhythmic thud-thud-thud that moved through the entire building and straight into the space behind her ribs where she kept all the things she was trying very hard not to remember. The life flight helicopter came at least twice a week, sometimes more, bringing trauma cases from car accidents and industrial explosions and the random violence that populated Portland's emergency department. Natalie had known it would arrive. She had known the sound. She had prepared herself. Her hand still shook. Just for a moment. Just long enough that if someone was watching, someone would see it. The clipboard slipped half an inch down her forearm. Her jaw tightened. Her breathing changed, shallow and fast and controlled, the way it changed when incoming fire was close enough to change the air pressure. And then it stopped. The trembling stopped because Natalie had trained herself to stop it, the way soldiers train themselves to stop bleeding, by will and repetition and the kind of exhaustion that comes from surviving things that shouldn't be survivable. Dr. Sterling had been watching. He stood at the far end of the nurse's station, reviewing patient files with the kind of attention that suggested he was reviewing something more interesting than patient files. His white coat was pristine, pressed that morning, probably by someone paid to press it. His tie was silk. His shoes were Italian leather, the kind that cost more than most people's rent. He was handsome in the way that wealth and privilege could manufacture handsomeness, his teeth too perfect to be natural, his hair the color of copper in direct light. He had been working at Sacred Heart for 4 years. He had never spoken to Natalie Hayes directly. He had never needed to. But now he was watching her. His eyes tracked her hands as the tremor passed, tracked her jaw as she reset it, tracked the way she turned her face toward the window as the helicopter settled onto the landing pad and the rotors began their wind-down sequence. The sound changed pitch as the speed dropped. The air pressure normalized. The danger, real or remembered, passed. And when Natalie turned back to her inventory, Dr. Sterling was still watching, his expression unreadable as winter, his notebook tucked under one arm like a weapon. He smiled then. Not the smile he gave patients. Not the smile he gave the board members and the hospital administrators and the pharmaceutical representatives who took him to lunch. This was a different smile. This was the smile of someone who had noticed something. A crack in the facade. A moment where the carefully constructed invisibility had flickered. The smile of someone who was going to use it. But Natalie didn't see it. She was already moving past him toward the supply room, her shoulders back, her head forward, her face a study in professional neutrality. The supply room was at the end of the cardiac unit, a narrow space lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, everything organized in perfect rows. Suture kits arranged by gauge and length. Syringes in ascending order of capacity. Sterile gauze pads stacked in towers of 100. Trauma shears arranged by color. Antiseptic solutions lined up like soldiers at attention. This was where Natalie felt most like herself. Her hands moved through the inventory with the kind of precision that came from years of practice, from field medicine courses and combat medic training and the particular kind of discipline that separated people who saved lives from people who lost them. She knew where everything was without looking. She could assemble a field dressing kit in 60 seconds with her eyes closed. She could perform emergency airway management with nothing but a curved needle and a steady hand. She could stop bleeding and start hearts and hold dying men together long enough for them to see one more sunrise. These were skills she was not supposed to have. These were skills that would raise questions if anyone paid attention. But no one paid attention to the supply room. No one paid attention to inventory. No one paid attention to the quiet nurse who restocked the shelves and logged everything in her small leather notebook and made sure that the surgical trays were always complete, always ready, always prepared for the moment when someone's life depended on the location of a specific needle or a specific length of suture. Natalie ran her fingers along the edge of the surgical tray, counting the items without moving them. 14-gauge angiocath needles. 12. Not 13. She made a note. The tray had been used since yesterday's inventory, which explained the discrepancy. She adjusted the log. The world was organized now. The pieces fit together. The inventory balanced. She pressed her palm against her ribs, against the inside of her jacket where the patch was sewn, where the faded fabric of her 3rd Battalion unit patch lived in constant darkness against her heart. She touched it every morning before her shift. She touched it every evening when she returned to her apartment. She touched it the way other people touched wedding rings or religious medals, a way of confirming that something real had happened, that she had been someone, that the quiet life was a choice and not a surrender. The supply room had a single window that faced the Portland skyline, tall buildings and rainy streets and people walking past with their lives intact and their hands clean and their sleep uninterrupted by the sound of helicopters or the memory of blood. Natalie looked out at them sometimes. She watched the way they moved through the world without calculating distances and angles and escape routes. She watched the way they assumed tomorrow would arrive. She envied them with a clarity that bordered on physical pain. But she had made her choice. The quiet life. The invisible life. The life where no one knew her name, not the doctors, not the other nurses, not the patients she helped save. The life where Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes could disappear entirely and simply be just a nurse, moving through the hospital like a ghost, present but unmarked, present but unremembered. The next words out of Dr. Sterling's mouth, when he appeared in the doorway of the supply room at 0718, changed everything. "You're very organized," he said. His voice was pleasant. Conversational. The kind of voice that didn't match the expression in his eyes. "I notice things about people. Organization like that, it's unusual in nurses. Most people in your position don't care enough to maintain records." He gestured at her notebook. "Where did you learn that?" The precision. The attention to detail. Natalie turned slowly. Her hands were empty. Her face was neutral. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and deferential, the voice of someone accustomed to occupying space without being noticed. "Hospital protocol, doctor." 10 words. No more. No less. Inventory management requires accuracy. He stepped into the supply room. The space suddenly felt smaller. "Of course it does," he said. "And you're very good at it. Very thorough. Very precise." He picked up a surgical tray, examining it. "You know, I always wonder about people who are too good at what they do. Too efficient. Makes me curious about their background." Natalie's hands were still. Her breathing was still. Everything in her was very, very still. "I'm just a nurse," she said. Dr. Sterling looked at her directly then. Really looked at her, the way a predator looks at prey that has just revealed itself to be faster, sharper, and far more dangerous than expected. And what he saw was a woman in navy scrubs with a scar on her neck and hands that didn't tremble anymore and eyes that had already seen the worst the world could offer. What he didn't see was the truth. But he was beginning to suspect it. Dr. Sterling leans against the nurse's station counter during morning rounds, his posture casual, his voice pitched to carry. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across the assembled staff, residents, nurses, 2 attending physicians all clustering around him like iron filings to a magnet. He's reviewing the new hire sheet, tapping his pen against the clipboard with deliberate rhythm. "I'll give her a week," he announces, not bothering to glance in Natalie's direction where she stands 3 stations down, updating a patient chart. His voice drops into the register he uses for confidential observations, loud enough that everyone hears it anyway. New nurses like that one, they fold under real pressure. Quiet types especially. No spine. He glances at the residents circling him, gauging their reactions. "Anyone want to take that bet? I say she quits by next Friday." Laughter ripples through the group like water finding its level. Someone mentioned something about money, about odds. One of the residents, a 3rd year named Martinez with 3-day stubble and eyes that haven't seen sleep in 36 hours, actually raises his hand. "I'll take that bet. $50 says she lasts." 75, someone else calls out. Natalie takes one measured breath through her nose. The air smells of antiseptic and coffee gone cold in styrofoam cups. She does not look up from the chart. Her pen moves across the vital signs section with the same precision she'd use marking targets on a range card. Pulse, respiration, blood pressure, the fundamentals. Numbers that don't lie. Numbers that don't care about bets or laughter or the certainty in Dr. Sterling's voice. She turns the page. Continues writing. What he doesn't understand about people like her, people who've kneeled in the dust of Helm and Province with their hands inside open abdomens, people who've heard the sound of their own breathing as the only thing between a wounded Marine and death, is that shame requires you to care what strangers think. Shame is a luxury. Natalie had left that behind somewhere between Sanjin Valley and the airfield at Bagram. The bet continues for another 4 minutes. Dr. Sterling adds theatrical details about turnover rates and the fragility of healthcare workers. The laughter builds. Then someone needs a consult, the crowd fragments, and the station empties back into the controlled chaos of Sacred Heart's main floor. Natalie finishes her documentation. Files the chart. Moves to the next patient. That afternoon, the cafeteria smells like reheated chicken and industrial-grade gravy. Natalie sits alone at a table by the east window, a salad she doesn't particularly want positioned in front of her. She's eating out of necessity, refueling the machine like she'd maintained her rifle, no sentiment, just maintenance. The hospital cafeteria on a Tuesday afternoon is never full. Maybe 30 staff scattered across the cavernous space. Most eating quickly between 12-hour shifts. Dr. Sterling enters from the south doors with his usual entourage, 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark, eager for scraps of his attention. He's gesturing about something, telling a story about a patient from his morning. His trajectory takes him directly past Natalie's table. He's not looking at her. That's the precision of it. He's looking at his residents, laughing at his own story, and he accidentally collides with the right side of her chair. The tray tilts. Physics is unforgiving. The bowl of salad launches sideways, dressing spraying across her scrubs in a pattern that would be beautiful if it weren't soup. The plastic cup of ginger ale hits the floor and bounces. The roll tumbles. And suddenly there is sound, the crash of plastic on tile, the gasp of nearby staff, the sudden silence that follows, every eye in the cafeteria swinging toward them like they're drawn on strings. Dr. Sterling steadies himself against an empty chair with exaggerated care, as though he's the victim of the collision. "You should watch where you sit, sweetheart," he says loudly, his voice syrup-smooth with false concern. His eyes meet hers for exactly 1 second, long enough for her to see the satisfaction there, the confirmation that he's landed the punch he intended. The room holds its breath. Natalie rises slowly. Her scrubs are soaked with vinaigrette. Her hands are steady. She kneels and begins gathering the pieces, the bowl, the cup, the napkins now soaked and useless. 1 tear escapes her right eye. Just 1. Physics again. Saline ducts responding to stimulus. She wipes it away without breaking eye contact as she stands, the fallen items gathered against her scrub top. "I've picked up pieces of people in Helmand Province," she says in a voice like still water, like something that has worn smooth rocks down to nothing through sheer, patient friction. This is nothing. She walks to the kitchen for napkins. Her movements are methodical. Controlled. Every gesture calculated for efficiency. Dr. Sterling watches her go, and for the first time, something flickers across his face. Not doubt. Not yet. But the beginning of the question, who is this person? The cafeteria noise resumes gradually, whispers stitching back into conversations. By the time she returns with paper towels and begins cleaning her workspace, the moment has already been filed away by most of the staff as simply another weird interaction with the new quiet nurse. But Dr. Sterling doesn't forget. He sits at a table 30 feet away, pretending to review something on his phone, watching her work. 2 days later, Thursday morning, the hallway outside room for 12 is narrow and institutional and lined with the machinery of modern medicine, oxygen ports, call buttons, the electronic hum of monitors in nearby rooms. Natalie is reviewing discharge orders when Dr. Sterling approaches from the opposite direction. He's carrying a patient chart. He's walking with purpose. She sees it coming the way soldiers see incoming fire, not a premonition, just pattern recognition. He throws the chart at her feet. Papers scatter like spooked birds, some sliding under the baseboard, others landing face down in a pattern that suggests violence. The chart's plastic cover cracks against the tile with a sound like a small gunshot. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he says, and his voice carries the kind of contempt usually reserved for things found on the bottom of shoes. "You're here to follow orders, not ask questions about supply requisitions." The hallway is empty. Whatever invisible audience he needed for the cafeteria is absent here. This is just performance for himself, for the pleasure of watching her comply. He leans against the wall opposite her, positioning himself so she has no choice but to acknowledge his presence while she works. She collects each page methodically, back to front, in order. Vanderbilt method, the way she'd been trained to organize information under fire, when chaos was trying to kill you and sequence was survival. The chart goes back together. Pages aligned. The plastic cover, cracked now, sliding back into place. She stands. Looks at him directly. Her eyes are the color of a winter Atlantic, the kind that sinks ships without mercy. The morphine inventory is short 40 vials, doctor, she says quietly. The ordered quantity doesn't match the delivered quantity. Should I file the report with pharmacy or with administration? His jaw tightens. Actually tightens, the muscle there going rigid as a ship's anchor. She watches him calculate what she knows, how much of a threat she represents, what move comes next. The two of them exist for a moment in perfect understanding. Then he steps aside. She walks past him down the corridor, the reassembled chart held against her chest like a shield. That night, alone in his office on the 4th floor with the city lights of Portland spread out below him like scattered coins, Dr. Sterling sits in the dark except for the glow of his computer screen. Natalie's personnel file is open. It's almost nothing, a community college nursing certificate from 7 years ago, a recent hire by HR based on her resume, reference letters from community health clinics that are now closed. No previous employment history before that. No education listed before the nursing certificate. No social media accounts that HR could find. It's the kind of record you construct when you're trying to disappear. He picks up his phone and dials Patricia Huang, one of the hospital board members. They exchange pleasantries. He reminds her about that malpractice settlement he covered for her in 2019, how he'd made sure her name never appeared in the discovery documents. She remembers. She owes him. I need someone gone, he says quietly. Not fired immediately. That would raise questions. But I need documentation. Incompetence. Witnessed errors. Anything you can find or create. She's on the nursing staff. New hire named Hayes. Patricia promises to look into it. She disconnects with the kind of efficiency that suggests she's done this before. He calls Robert Chen next. The board member whose son had been rejected from medical school twice before Dr. Sterling made a very specific recommendation during admissions committee review. Robert picks up on the third ring. I need a favor, Sterling says. Nothing complicated. Some paperwork, some observations, a few conversations in the right places. By the time he finishes the fourth call to Dennis Crawford, the private investigator whose business card sits permanently in Sterling's desk drawer, the one who specializes in personnel compliance issues, it's past midnight. Crawford promises results within a week. Documentation of incompetence. Patient complaints. Witnessed errors. The infrastructure of a professional execution. What Sterling doesn't know as he disconnects the call is that Natalie has spent the same evening sitting at her kitchen table in her small rental house in southeast Portland, her fingers moving across a keyboard, constructing a spreadsheet with the precision of someone building a legal case. 3 months of data. Surgical supply billing records cross-referenced against actual inventory. The phantom orders that appear on invoices but never arrive in the supply closet. The numbers that don't reconcile. She's arranged them in columns, in rows, in the kind of logical sequence that transforms suspicion into evidence. The pattern is unmistakable. Medicare billing for supplies that don't exist. Invoices for products never delivered. Someone is siphoning money. Someone is committing fraud. And she's been noticing because she was trained to notice, trained to track resources under conditions of scarcity, trained to make sure that what's on the manifest matches what's in the field. She saves the spreadsheet to a thumb drive. A small black object, barely larger than her thumbnail. She places it in a drawer in her nightstand, underneath her service medical shears, and closes the drawer without deciding what to do with the evidence yet. Some knowledge requires time before it can become action. Back at Sacred Heart, Dr. Sterling begins his campaign in earnest. He questions her assessments in front of patients, deliberately undermining her judgment. "Are you certain about that reading, Nurse Hayes?" in a tone that suggests she's probably wrong. He assigns her the most difficult cases with inadequate support: a septic patient who needs hourly monitoring, a post-operative woman with complications that require vigilance he doesn't provide resources for. He documents his concerns about her judgment in official memos to administration, building a file with the meticulous care of an architect. She meets each challenge with the same methodical composure. She doesn't complain. She doesn't ask for help. She simply works harder, stays later, checks vitals more frequently, and never gives him the satisfaction of seeing her struggle. Every patient she's assigned walks out of Sacred Heart stabilized and recovering. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sterling was beginning to understand that breaking someone required more than public humiliation. The quiet ones, the ones who'd survived things that would shatter ordinary people, they broke differently. You couldn't crack them with bets or collisions or thrown charts. You needed to find what they loved and destroy it systematically, methodically, the way a surgeon removes a tumor, with precision and patience. And he was patient. He had nothing but time, and allies in a network that stretched from the hospital board to the state licensing office. He had leverage. He had a decade of favors called in. What he didn't have was any understanding of who he was actually trying to destroy. That would matter very soon. The cardiac unit at Sacred Heart was a different world from the general floors, quieter, more controlled, the kind of place where every beat carried weight. Natalie pushed the vitals cart to wardroom for 12 at 1,430 hours, her eyes already cataloguing the monitors before she stepped through the door. The man in the bed was 62, grey-haired, with shoulders that still held the shape of someone who'd spent decades standing at attention. Admiral Richard Mitchell. The name on the chart meant nothing to her. The bearing meant everything. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. But her hands steadied themselves on the blood pressure cuff with the deliberate precision of someone who'd just recognized a landmine in the road. "Blood pressure, sir?" she asked, her voice neutral as still water. "Just make it quick," he said, and there was something in the cadence, the clipped efficiency, the way he didn't ask, just commanded, that made her fingers move through the motions on autopilot. 148/89. Elevated. Her eyes caught the slight puffing of his neck veins, the way they distended with each breath. Muffled heart sounds when she listened with the stethoscope. The subtle signs that whispered of pressure building somewhere deep in his chest cavity, though his EKG looked almost normal. Almost. She documented everything in the chart with meticulous precision. Blood pressure. Heart rate 96. Respiratory rate 18. O2 sat 94 on room air. She wrote what she saw, not what the monitors wanted to show. That was the discipline that had kept her alive in forward operating bases, where the difference between careful observation and wishful thinking was the difference between going home or coming home in a flag-draped box. Dr. Sterling arrived at 15:20 to review the Admiral's case. Natalie watched from the medication station as he walked past her without acknowledging her presence. He spent exactly 11 minutes reviewing the chart, his face unreadable. Then he turned and walked directly to the nurse's station manager, Linda Chen, a woman with 23 years at Sacred Heart and no patience for politics. "The Admiral needs to transfer back to the VA facility," Sterling said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. "This case requires specialized cardiac intervention we can't provide. I've already called ahead. They can take him tomorrow morning." Natalie's hands paused over the medication log. The Admiral had been here 6 hours. The symptoms were building, not stabilizing. She knew this the way she knew wind direction in Helmand Province before the dust storms hit, not from instruments, but from the accumulation of small observations that added up to a single truth: danger. What happened next was the kind of tactical move that separated competent operators from amateurs. Sterling didn't yell at her. Didn't accuse her of anything. He simply walked to the cardiac unit manager and spoke in a voice just loud enough for Natalie to hear. "I need to implement some new supply protocols in the cardiac unit. Too much inventory loss lately. Effective immediately. All supply requisitions require my direct approval. Additionally, I'm reassigning floor nurse duties. Natalie will be transitioning to routine care only, basic vitals, medications I've pre-approved. Nothing beyond scope without explicit authorization. It was brilliant, actually. Devastating in its simplicity. Not a personal attack. Just policy. Just protection. Just removing her from the position where her precision with inventory had already started asking questions about those phantom surgical orders, those small additions that made the numbers blur and dance in ways that only someone trained to count ammunition and field supplies would notice. Natalie felt the reassignment settle over her like a weight in deep water. She didn't argue. Didn't protest. Didn't even blink. She simply nodded and returned to her medication cart, her face a blank slate, her internal architecture shifting with the speed of a trained operator adapting to new combat conditions. The Admiral's condition deteriorated through the afternoon. His chest pain increased. His blood pressure began its downward drift, 148/89 at 14:30, now 132/84 by 1900. The EKG strips showed more changes, subtle ones that only someone reading them obsessively would catch. Natalie read them obsessively. She developed the habit during her last deployment, when the difference between reading vital signs and reading death coming through the door was measured in seconds of response time. At 19:45, she approached Dr. Sterling in the hallway outside the Admiral's room. Her voice was deferential, careful, the tone of someone asking permission from an authority figure. "Doctor, I've reviewed the Admiral's rhythm strips from the last 4 hours. I'm seeing subtle ST changes and his neck veins appear more distended. His blood pressure is dropping. I think we should do an echocardiogram now, before his condition." "I've been reading EKG since before you graduated nursing school," Sterling said, not looking up from his phone. "He's stable for transfer. The VA will handle whatever this is. Get him ready for 0800 transport." He walked away before she could speak again. This was stage 3 of the escalation, the strategic move. Not cruelty. Just competent institutional sabotage. By restricting her access, by implementing new approval requirements, by dismissing her clinical observations with the weight of his authority, he'd effectively silenced her. Any recommendation she made now would have to go through him. Any concern she raised would be filtered through his judgment. Any warning would be subject to his veto. She understood tactics. She'd lived them. She'd breathed them in the thin air of mountains where miscommunication was lethal. At 21:30, Natalie sat in the break room with a cup of coffee she didn't drink. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the antiseptic undertone that never quite left hospital air, no matter how many times you cleaned. Her locker was in the corner, and inside it, beneath her spare scrubs, was a jacket she never wore, a denim jacket with a faded patch sewn into the lining. A unit patch. The colors had faded from years of sun and sand and time, from a place she'd deliberately left behind. The patch that read 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse, in threads that were barely visible anymore. She pressed her palm against the jacket, feeling the embroidered letters through the denim. Her other hand reached into her scrub pocket and found the small silver object there, a challenge coin from FOB Shank, from a commander who'd promoted her to senior chief petty officer in a ceremony conducted in a concrete room while mortars impacted the perimeter 300 meters away. The coin was warm from her body heat. She hadn't prayed since Marcus died. 5 years of careful silence before God, a unilateral decision she'd made the day they handed her a folded flag and told her his helicopter had failed to clear the ridge line by 4 meters. But at 21:45, in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee and institutional neglect, she whispered something to the empty air anyway. "If you're listening, I need to know what to do." The break room hummed with the sound of the vending machine compressor cycling on and off. Outside the window, Portland rain had begun to fall, the kind of steady percussion that sounded like distant incoming fire if you closed your eyes and let the old patterns return. At 22:47, the cardiac monitor alarm shrieked from the Admiral's room. Not a gentle notification. A full code alarm. The sound cut through the unit like a blade. Natalie's eyes opened. Her hand released the challenge coin. Her training didn't ask permission. Her training didn't consult policies or approval chains. Her training simply moved her body out of the break room at a speed that was already becoming a run before her conscious mind had finished processing the decision. Whatever was about to happen would change everything. She could feel it approaching like weather, pressure building, temperature dropping, the electric taste of ozone on her tongue. But she had no idea that an admiral with a failing heart and a deep, life-threatening accumulation of fluid pressing against his cardiac chambers was about to become the man who brought down not just Dr. Sterling, but brought an entire military infrastructure down with him. She had no idea that the next 5 hours would erase every choice she'd made to disappear. She simply moved toward the sound of the alarm, toward the danger, toward the patient who was about to teach her that some kinds of heroism can't be hidden, no matter how carefully you try. The code alarm shattered the hospital silence at 2,147 hours. Natalie moved before her conscious mind caught up with her muscle memory, abandoning the break room, her prayer still incomplete. The cardiac unit corridor stretched ahead of her like a runway, fluorescent panels casting everything in surgical white. Her boots found the tile with the kind of precision that came from 1,000 combat medicine runs, each footfall a metronome counting down to something she couldn't yet name. Admiral Mitchell's room erupted into controlled chaos. The machines screamed their digital warnings, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, blood pressure collapsing, heart rate climbing toward the 150s. She saw it before she saw him, the distended neck veins bulging purple against his skin, the classical sign of backup, of pressure, of something mechanical suffocating the heart from the outside in. His breathing came in gasps, each one shallower than the last, his lips taking on the blue-gray tint of a man drowning in his own chest cavity. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac. The heart crushed like a fist closing around a bird. Two residents stood in the doorway, frozen in the peculiar paralysis that academic medicine sometimes taught, the hesitation of people trained to wait for permission, to consult the hierarchy, to check the protocols. They looked at her with the expression of drowning swimmers searching for a lifeguard who wasn't coming. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for Dr. Sterling or his approval chains or his restricting orders that had already cost 5 hours of this man's life. Her hands were already moving toward the ultrasound unit, pushing the portable machine close to the bedside, her fingers finding the controls by muscle memory that predated her civilian life by 15 years. The probe contacted his skin, and there it was, a black lake of fluid surrounding the heart like an enemy siege. 60, maybe 70 milliliters of blood compressing the chambers, throttling the cardiac output. 15 seconds. That's all the confirmation she needed. She turned to the crash cart without speaking. The spinal needle came free from its package with a whisper of plastic, 18 gauge, long enough to reach through the chest wall to the pericardial space beneath the breastbone. The Admiral's eyes found hers, conscious enough to understand what was happening, frightened enough to trust her anyway. She prepped the subxiphoid area with alcohol, her hand steady as a surgical laser, and positioned the needle at the angle where ribs became sternum, where anatomy became necessity. One breath. The needle advanced. The angle was perfect, 15 degrees toward the left shoulder, aiming for the pericardial sac like a hunter aiming for the heart. She felt the resistance of tissue layers, the give of the fibrous pericardium, and then the sudden release as the needle entered the space where blood had no right to be. Dark red blood filled the syringe. 40 seconds. The withdrawal of 60 milliliters from around his heart took less time than most people spend choosing a coffee order. With each cc drawn, she felt his breathing ease, watched his neck veins collapse back to normal, saw the color return to his face like a photograph developing in reverse. The monitors began their slow descent toward normal, the digital chorus of salvation sung in beeps and numbers. 110/70. Oxygen saturation climbing. Heart rate dropping. Sinus rhythm. The Admiral gasped like a man surfacing from water, his hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes locked on her face with the intensity of someone who had just been given back his life and recognized exactly who had done the giving. His voice came out as barely a whisper, forced through the gratitude and shock and something else, something like recognition. Valkyrie. The word stopped time. Natalie's hands went perfectly still. The syringe hung in her grip like a weapon she'd suddenly remembered she was carrying. Her face drained of blood with the speed of a puncture wound, and she felt her legs threaten to give way beneath her. No one had spoken that name in 20 years. No one who knew what it meant, who understood that Valkyrie wasn't a call sign, it was a memory she'd buried so deep that some days she convinced herself it belonged to someone else entirely. Valkyrie. Afghanistan. His grip tightened on her wrist. His voice was gaining strength with each word, oxygen-rich blood returning to his brain. You carried me out. The field hospital. I was 19 years old, and you were the medic who put my arm back together when the surgeon said it was gone. Natalie stepped back. Her head moved in a small, deliberate shake, a denial that came too late to matter. But the Admiral wasn't finished. His eyes held hers across the space between them like a hook through her chest, pulling up memories she'd spent 2 decades learning to live with by forgetting them entirely. I'm looking at you, he whispered. I'm finally looking at you. Dr. Sterling arrived at 2,217 hours, still in the tailored dinner jacket he'd worn to the fundraiser, his collar slightly undone, his hair catching the overhead lights like polished mahogany. He took in the scene with the quick calculation of a man whose entire career depended on assessing risk at a glance. Admiral Mitchell stable. Natalie standing at the bedside, her hands trembling not with fear but with the effort of restraint. The resident still frozen in the doorway. The ultrasound image still displayed on the monitor, the pericardial fluid drawn off, the evidence of a procedure performed without his knowledge or approval hanging there like an indictment. For exactly 1 second, Natalie watched his mind work behind his eyes. The calculation. The recalibration. The pivot toward what he did best, the activation of his network, the calls to people who owed him favors, the choreography of institutional leverage. Within the hour, it began. Patricia Huang took his call at home, her voice tight with the knowledge of what favors meant and what they cost. Robert Chen received an urgent text requesting immediate action. The investigator, the one Sterling had used twice before to bury patient complaints and silence inconvenient nurses, sent over his freshly fabricated findings, 3 separate complaints of reckless conduct, practicing beyond scope of licensure, and endangering patient safety. The contact at the state licensing board confirmed he would flag the incident within 24 hours, moving it to expedited review. By 0800 the next morning, the machine had already begun its work. Natalie was summoned to the administration office on the 3rd floor. The room smelled of leather and coffee and the particular sterile anxiety of institutional betrayal. 3 people waited for her, Patricia Huang, Robert Chen, and a security officer with the neutral expression of someone who had done this before. The cardboard box was already sitting on the table like a gravestone marker. We've received serious complaints about your conduct yesterday, Huang said, sliding the fabricated reports across the mahogany surface. Patient endangerment. Performing procedures outside your scope of practice. The state board has flagged the incident. We have no choice but to accept your resignation effective immediately. Natalie didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't tell them that the Admiral had been dying, that the residents had frozen, that the pericardiocentesis was emergency medicine at its most elementary. She simply listened to the words fall like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that would spread outward in ways they couldn't yet calculate. The security officer escorted her to her locker. Her badge was deactivated with a soft electronic click. Her scrubs, her stethoscope, her trauma shears, 15 months of accumulated presence, went into the cardboard box. By 0900, she was walking through the lobby of Sacred Heart Hospital with quiet dignity, past nurses who wouldn't meet her eyes, past the reception desk, past the gift shop that sold flowers and magazines and the temporary illusion that hospitals were places where people got better. She had saved a Navy admiral's life at 2,150 hours. By 0900 the next morning, she had been erased from the hospital's employ as if she'd never existed at all. That night, Natalie drove to Mount Calvary Cemetery in the rain. The stones stood like soldiers at attention, each one marking the territory of someone who had chosen a different kind of permanence. Marcus's grave was in the southwest corner, beneath an oak tree that had witnessed 5 years of her midnight visits and silent conversations that never quite added up to prayer. She knelt on the wet grass, mud soaking through her jeans, and pulled the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the 3rd Battalion insignia, worn soft as skin from 1,000 fingers tracing its edges. "I failed again, Marcus," she whispered. "I can't even hold on to the small quiet life." The rain fell harder. Thunder rolled across Portland like distant artillery, and for just a moment, Natalie Hayes let herself remember what it felt like to be Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes, the woman who'd carried wounded Marines out of fire, who'd held young men's lives in her hands, who'd somehow learned that some heroism can't be hidden no matter how carefully you try to disappear. But that night, she thought she was finally alone. She had no idea that the Pentagon had already been notified. She had no idea that phones were ringing in Arlington and San Diego and Virginia Beach. She had no idea that Admiral Mitchell, lying in his hospital bed with a chest tube and a new lease on life, had already made 3 calls to people he'd known for 30 years, people who understood that some debts were sacred, some loyalty was non-negotiable, and some people needed to be brought home whether they wanted to come or not. Security walked her to the parking lot at 18:47 hours. 5 hours after she'd saved Admiral Mitchell's life. The cardboard box held everything that mattered, her locker emptied by someone else's hands, her badge deactivated with a magnetic swipe that made a sound like a small death. Nobody spoke during the walk. The rain had started, thin and cold, the kind that soaks through fabric before you notice it's falling. Her name tag was already gone from the uniform they told her to turn in by end of shift. Instead, she wore borrowed scrubs belonging to someone with smaller shoulders. She drove to the cemetery in northeast Portland because the only person who'd understand was already buried there. The rain had become insistent by 21:45 hours, hammering the granite headstone with the precision of machine gun fire. She knelt in the mud anyway, her knees sinking into ground that hadn't frozen yet, and pulled the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the one from 3rd Battalion that she'd sewn there with field stitching and a needle salvaged from a first aid kit in Helmand Province. The patch was the color of old blood now, the embroidered insignia barely visible under 18 years of wear and sweat and rain that felt like penance. "I failed again, Marcus," she whispered into the stone. "I can't even hold on to the small quiet life." The patch trembled in her hands, not from cold, from everything else. She pressed it against her heart and knelt there while the rain turned the cemetery into a place that looked like grief itself. Nobody saw her. Nobody was supposed to see her. That was the whole arrangement, anonymity in exchange for peace. But peace was a lie she'd been telling herself for 5 years, and now even that small comfortable fiction had been taken away. What she didn't know was that phones were already ringing. The convoy pulled through Sacred Heart's main entrance at 08 for 7 hours the next morning. 3 vehicles. Black SUVs with government plates that made the parking lot go quiet. 14 personnel in dress uniforms, the kind worn for ceremonies or for making a point. The kind that said authority in a language that hospitals understood perfectly. Admiral Mitchell was supposed to stay in bed. The cardiac surgeon had made that explicit at 0630 during rounds. But the Admiral had smiled, the same smile that had commanded a carrier strike group, and said, "Son, I've been shot, stabbed, and nearly had my heart crushed by fluid I couldn't breathe around. I can walk 200 feet. It wasn't a request. It was a command." He walked now, moving through Sacred Heart's main corridor with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. His chest was still bandaged under his dress uniform, his movements careful but deliberate. He was followed by a woman in a captain's insignia, 3 enlisted personnel with classified credentials, and a man in a dark suit whose badge read FBI, Regional Field Office. Natalie was standing in the hallway outside the cardiac unit with her termination papers still in her hands, reading them for the 4th time because the words didn't make sense in any order she arranged them. Wrongful conduct. Practicing beyond scope. Reckless endangerment. All of it fabricated. All of it signed by Dr. Sterling. The Admiral stopped 3 feet away. His eyes, the color of a stormy Atlantic, found hers and held them with the weight of recognition. He whispered a single word. Valkyrie. The hallway contracted. 2 decades collapsed into the space between them. She heard the rotor wash of a Black Hawk in her ears, felt the weight of a 19-year-old SEAL with a through-and-through femoral wound, remembered the blood on her hands in the field hospital at Bagram that smelled like copper and diesel fuel, and the only thing standing between someone and death was her ability to move without hesitation. The Admiral's aide stepped forward. His hands were trembling. He held a file marked classified, red stamped across every page. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, he read, his voice steady now. Navy Cross recipient. Commendation for extracting 12 wounded Marines under fire from hostile Taliban positions, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, August 2004. The hallway was filling with people now. Hospital staff emerging from doorways. A camera crew from local news that had somehow been tipped off. The CEO Margaret Walsh appeared, her face pale, understanding in that moment that everything about this morning was about to change the trajectory of Sacred Heart's liability exposure. A SEAL team leader she recognized walked forward, older now, his face weathered by 20 years of operations, and his voice carried through the corridor like a prayer. 2 bronze stars. Purple Heart. And every single one of us who was in that field hospital remembers the medic who didn't leave anyone behind. He was looking at her now, and his eyes were wet. 19 years old, I was. You saved my life when I was supposed to be dying. I looked for you for 2 decades. I'm looking at you for the first time in 20 years, Senior Chief. The FBI agent in the dark suit turned to Dr. Sterling, who had just emerged from his office, his face the color of a man who'd watched his entire world collapse in the space of 10 seconds. The agent's name was Torres. His voice was conversational, which made it more devastating than any shout could have been. Dr. James Sterling. We're here to investigate 3 years of Medicare fraud. Phantom surgical supply orders totaling $2.3 million. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. And witness intimidation, the fabrication of complaints against Senior Chief Hayes for the express purpose of preventing her from testifying to the precise inventory documentation that led federal investigators directly to your fraud. The hallway went so quiet you could hear the ventilators running in the rooms around them. Your private investigator Dennis Crawford is already in custody, Torres continued, pulling papers from his briefcase. He's turned state's evidence. His files contain all communications showing you ordered him to manufacture complaints. Your contact at the state licensing board resigned this morning when the subpoenas arrived. Your network has dissolved, Doctor. Every person you called is now either under investigation or cooperating with federal authorities. The hospital atrium, 2 hours later, was packed. Reporters with cameras. Board members sitting in chairs that had been arranged like a firing squad. CEO Margaret Walsh stood at a podium with legal counsel, her voice steady as granite. Dr. James Sterling is hereby terminated, effective immediately, for healthcare fraud, patient endangerment, and wrongful termination of hospital staff in an attempt to obstruct an ongoing federal investigation. Security walked him out the same way they'd walked out Natalie. The same cardboard box. The same exit that was supposed to mean nothing had mattered. But this time the cameras followed every step. This time his medical license was suspended pending criminal charges. This time the hospital issued a formal apology to Natalie Hayes, offered reinstatement with back pay, and stood in front of local news to explain that they had made a terrible mistake in trusting a man whose competence had been excellent camouflage for his criminality. Natalie stood in the corner in her borrowed scrubs and said nothing. Processing felt like drowning slowly. Recognition felt like frostbite coming back to warmth, painful in ways she hadn't anticipated. 6 months later, she stood in her navy dress uniform for the first time in 2 decades. The ribbons were arranged across her chest in their proper order. The medals hung beneath them. Senior Chief Petty Officer insignia on her collar. The fabric felt like remembering how to breathe. Sacred Heart held a ceremony in the main atrium. Admiral Mitchell, fully recovered, placed his hand on her shoulder. You saved me twice, he said. Once when I was a 19-year-old Marine in Afghanistan, and once when I was a 62-year-old Admiral in Portland. Both times, you were exactly where you were supposed to be. The hospital created the Hayes Protocol, a comprehensive program for recognizing and supporting veteran healthcare workers in civilian medical careers. Natalie accepted a position as Director of Emergency Services. She designed programs that understood PTSD wasn't weakness, that invisible injuries were still injuries, that some people needed to disappear to survive but could be brought back home when the time was right. In the audience, she saw faces from her unit. People she hadn't spoken to in years. They'd found her after the news broke. They weren't letting her disappear again. Dr. Sterling was teaching CPR at a community college for minimum wage now, awaiting trial on 14 counts of healthcare fraud. Natalie didn't feel triumph about that. She felt the quiet relief of being seen again. She walked the cardiac unit at dawn the next week. When the Black Hawk landed on the roof, the one that brought transplant teams and critical transfers, she heard the rotor wash and didn't flinch. She walked toward the sound instead. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. If Natalie's story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated or if you've served and found it difficult to adjust, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment about a time when someone showed you that your value was greater than what others could see. Your story matters. Thank you for watching.